The storm had already started when the last man laughed. "Better hope that green carpet of hers don't sprout in the night," he barked, voice thick with whiskey, gesturing toward the hill where the widow's odd-looking roof poked up like a mossy hump of earth. "Or she'll wake up to vines growing out her ears." They all chuckled. About 7 of them, wrapped in wool, gloves half frozen, stiff already. The snow came down sideways, needles in the wind. Every man could feel it worming through the seams of their cabins, through cracked walls and crooked shingles, except, of course, the widow's place, which sat smug and green against the white swirl. Her chimney puffed gentle smoke, her windows glowed, and nobody could explain why. They'd called her strange when she first hauled wheelbarrows of moss up onto the roof, pressing it into place with handfuls of mud, weaving it through bark she'd stripped from downed logs. No nails, no tar, just earth and living green. Called her roof a swamp on stilts, said it would rot, fall in, grow mold that'd poison her boys in their sleep. That was 2 winters ago. The boys were still breathing, and her roof never sagged once. But now the whole town was freezing. Every house in Hollow Creek was bleeding heat. Frost bloomed on the inside of window panes. Firewood vanished faster than men could chop it. Chimneys smoked black, thick, desperate. But up the hill, the widow's place was still and warm. No frantic clatter of axes, no shouting, just a quiet, constant warmth that hadn't faltered once since the first flake hit, and they hated her for it. Nobody said it aloud, not yet, but deep down, behind every chapped lip and wind-burned eye, it festered. A thing too soft for men to admit but sharp enough to make them bitter. Shame, because she had done something none of them understood. And it worked. They didn't know the half of it. Her name was Clara Avery, and she never meant to outdo anyone. She had 2 boys, a cow, and a debt on the land so steep it made her stomach sour just looking at the bankman's letters. Her husband, Thomas, had died hauling timber in a creek flood 4 years earlier, swept clean away when the bridge collapsed. That winter nearly broke her. She burned furniture. She boiled pine needles to drink when the tea ran out. She stuffed rags in the walls and still woke up with ice on her blanket. The next spring, when the snow melted, she walked barefoot into the woods behind her land and didn't come back for hours. She came back with moss. Not just any moss. She'd picked it carefully, the thick kind that grew like a sponge across shaded boulders, vibrant green and heavy with moisture, the kind that stayed alive even under snow. She didn't say why, she didn't explain it, not even to her boys. She just started hauling it, basket after basket, and when she ran out of nails, she lashed sticks across the roof beams with vine and pressed the moss into place like bedding. By the time the neighbors caught wind, the roof was already alive. They mocked her, of course, said she was distracted, not right in the head, mourning too long, but Clara didn't flinch. She barely looked up from her work. She'd been cold once, so cold her fingers bled, and she wasn't ever going back. The thing about moss is, it holds water like a sponge and freezes slow. It muffles wind. It insulates better than any cedar shake or tar sheet. The roots bind into mud like felt, and once she packed the gaps with snow-soaked leaves and sealed the eaves with river clay, her roof became something more than a shelter. It became a membrane. It breathed, but she never told them that. She just let them laugh. Now, as the storm worsened, they stopped laughing. Down in town, the Morgan place lost a chimney brick that night. The pipe twisted loose from the stove and filled the cabin with smoke. 4 people choking. Snow had drifted inside by morning. They nearly froze before daylight. 2 doors down, old Miss Darling's stove gave out altogether. The spark died, and her sons couldn't get it lit again, not with wet kindling, not with the coals packed in burlap, not even with kerosene. The frost in her cabin reached the kitchen. Bread froze solid, so did the dog's water bowl. By the 3rd night, there were 23 people who couldn't feel their toes. Infants wrapped in blankets so stiff they cracked. A schoolteacher sleeping in the church beside the pulpit, hoping the high ceiling would trap a little heat. It didn't, and through it all, the widow's moss roof shed snow like a duck's back. She never rubbed it in. She just fed her boys soup and checked the roofline every morning, touching it with bare hands to feel where the frost clung. Where it didn't, she had laid it in layers, moss on moss, padded over with thick bark, a final layer of damp-soaked fern. It was heavy, yes, but warm as anything ever built. Not a single draft passed through. By the 4th night, 3 families walked up the hill and knocked. Clara opened the door before they knocked twice. She never hesitated. She let them in, pointed to the lofts, passed them cups of broth she'd made from root scraps and salt. Her boys gave up their blankets. Nobody said thank you. Nobody could. Their faces were too frozen, too ashamed. She never asked for it. But that was the night the resentment changed shape. It turned into fear. Because once you see someone survive what's killing you, it becomes hard not to wonder how far they'd go and what else they know. That fear, low and mean, slithered between walls. Men who couldn't keep their own fires going now started whispering to each other that maybe it wasn't natural how her place stayed warm, that maybe it wasn't just the moss, that maybe she'd done something else, something dark. "She don't come to church much," one said. "Talks to herself too. I seen her burying glass jars by the creek. I heard her say something to the trees once. Maybe she's got a book. One of them books." It wasn't the roof that scared them. It was what it meant, that she'd figured something out, that she didn't need them, that she didn't fear what they feared. By the 5th night, they started blaming her for the storm. The worst cold hit after midnight. Winds tore the shingles off 2 more homes. The sawmill burned its last log. A child nearly died when their blanket caught fire trying to dry it over a stove. A baby cried itself breathless. And still, Clara's home glowed soft on the hill. No flickering, no wood smoke choked with soot, just a steady warmth they couldn't understand. A crowd gathered in front of the church. At first it was just to talk, to complain, to find someone to blame, but it thickened fast. Men with red noses, women in frozen shawls, the town blacksmith with frost in his beard and something harder in his eye. They didn't bring torches, not yet, but they brought their fear, and in that fear they brought fire of another kind. They climbed the hill, and Clara saw them coming. Clara didn't move when she saw them. She'd stepped out into the snow to check the eaves again, mittens soaked, sleeves crusted in frost. She always checked the edges first, where the cold crept in quiet, waiting for cracks, for slack spots in the clay, or weak seams in the bark. But her hands froze in place when she looked down the hill and saw them rising up in the snow like smoke from a fire that shouldn't be burning. 6, no, 7, 8 now, bundled tight, heads down, faces hidden under hats and scarves. But she recognized the walk, that stiffness, that clumsy, bitter silence. You don't walk like that unless you're marching towards something you hate and haven't figured out why. She'd seen that kind of walk before. When the debt collectors came to take her father's cattle, when the reverend came to scold her mother for singing in the dark. They weren't coming for a visit. She didn't wake the boys. She stepped back inside, shut the door quiet, and stoked the fire just once more. Not out of fear, out of habit, because whatever happened next, the fire had to keep going. The heat had to hold. The knock came seconds later, hard, 3 fists, maybe 4, pounding not just the door, but the frame, the wall, the air itself. It was the kind of knock meant to claim space, not request entry. She didn't open it. She spoke through the door. "My boys are sleeping," she said, voice low but clear. "You got 10 families, half froze," came the reply, low and coarse. She thought it was Carter Baines. He ran the tannery, never liked her much. His wife had once told Clara that moss made her think of graveyards. "I know," Clara said. "I took in 3. 3 ain't 10, another voice snapped, a woman this time. "Aggie Durham, maybe. You got room, you got heat, and you sit up here in the warm while babies freeze down in town." Clara glanced at the hearth. The soup was still simmering. She'd stretched the broth thinner tonight, trying to make it last. Even now, it wouldn't feed more than 2 or 3 more. "There's no room," she said. "We've done what we can." That was the wrong answer. A fist struck the door hard enough to rattle it on the hinges. Snow slid from the moss above as the walls vibrated. The fire cracked. "You got no right to hoard heat," the tannery man barked. "Ain't natural what you built. Roof like a swamp, and you're the only one warm. You think we're stupid?" Someone else hissed. "You think we don't see what this is? It's moss," she said. "That's all. Just moss and bark. I've shown no one harm." "Then show us the roof. Show us the inside. Prove you ain't hiding something." She heard the shift in tone, how quickly demand slipped toward threat, that creeping edge, the kind of tone that didn't expect a no. "I won't open the door," she said. "Not in this wind. You're welcome to come tomorrow, in daylight." But there wouldn't be a tomorrow, not if their tone kept sharpening like that, not if the cold kept chewing its way into their bones. Desperation doesn't wait for daylight. She stepped back from the door and reached for the iron shovel she kept by the hearth, not to swing, just to hold. Her hands needed something solid. "You all think you're the only ones hurting," she called out. "But my boys shivered too. My husband died 3 winters ago on the river. We starved same as you. I bled my fingers packing this roof. I built this with nothing but what the woods gave me." But the mob didn't want truth. They wanted heat. They wanted someone to blame for not having it. And Clara understood something in that moment. Something cold and sharp and permanent. They didn't care how she'd done it. They only cared that she had. The next blow cracked the latch. She heard the wood splinter. Not much, but enough to know they weren't leaving. They weren't making a point. They were coming in, not with torches, not with violence, not yet, but with force, with fingers wrapped around fear and shame and the raw, naked hunger of a people who couldn't understand how they'd been bested by a woman who once cried herself hoarse over a man none of them respected. She dropped the shovel, not out of fear, out of choice, because if they broke in and found her holding it, the story would never be hers again. Instead, she opened the door, just enough for her body to block the entry. The cold stabbed in behind them like a knife. Her boys stirred upstairs. The fire behind her dimmed, confused by the sudden draw of air. They crowded forward, 8 faces, eyes like stone. Some she knew by name, some she didn't recognize at all, just shadows from the church pews or the feed line. But every one of them wore the same look, a brittle blend of outrage and disbelief. They were angry not just that she was warm, but that she had been right. "I told you," she said. "It's just moss." And then, like a fool, she stepped aside. They didn't rampage. They didn't shout. They didn't overturn the furniture or strike her or curse the name of God in her house. They simply walked in, quiet, stunned. One by one, they shed coats and gloves, eyes darting across the rafters, the roof line, the walls, and they saw it. The inside matched the outside. Woven layers of bark and clay packed between the beams. Moss pressed into every corner, dry on the inside, but dense enough to trap the heat from the central hearth. Steam rose from drying boots by the fire. A smell of fern and wood smoke lingered in the air. The walls themselves felt warm, and yet no nails, no modern shingles, no chimney cap, just earth laced into memory. "Damn thing's breathing," Carter muttered. Clara nodded. "That's the point." Aggie stepped close to one wall, touched the moss with one gloved finger, and frowned. "How's it not frozen?" "It's alive," Clara said. "Not alive like you or me, but alive enough to hold warmth. You don't kill it, you feed it. Moisture, darkness. In return, it keeps the cold out." A long silence. "You read this in a book?" someone asked, almost accusingly. "No," Clara said. "I watched birds, watched how they packed nests, watched how the snow never melted on some rocks, but always did on others. The moss traps heat. It holds. You just have to believe what your hands learn." They didn't believe her. Not yet. But they didn't destroy the house either. They sat. One by one, they sank down beside the fire, shedding their disbelief with each breath they took that didn't hurt. Fingers thawed, faces softened, children whimpered, then slept. One man wept quietly, and no one asked why. And in that strange, wordless calm, Clara did what she had done every night since the cold came. She stirred the soup. By morning, the storm deepened. The town was white over white, the church barely a shape in the snow. The mill chimney collapsed before sunrise. 2 cabins caved. One man was found half frozen in a root cellar, curled beside a sack of potatoes. They wrapped his hands in wool but knew the fingers were gone. But on the hill, Clara's roof held, and so did her house. She couldn't fit them all. There was no space, but word spread, even in the cold, not about the moss, but about the warmth, and about how she let them in. So others came, not in mobs now, but in pairs, in silence, carrying blankets, babies, the weak. They didn't knock anymore. They stood at the edge of the house, waiting to be seen, and Clara saw them. She never turned any away. The loft filled first, then the corners of the kitchen, then the hallway. Every nook packed with bodies huddled together, heat shared, food stretched. They spoke less, slept more, and in that strange, silent togetherness, something cracked. Not the roof, not the walls, but the story. Because stories don't survive truth, and the truth was, the widow they'd mocked had saved more of them than the mayor or the pastor or the sheriff ever had. She'd done it with moss and grit, and a kindness so quiet it left no room for pride. That afternoon, one boy from town, a 16-year-old named Jonah Dent, watched Clara pack snow into a clay bowl and heat it slow over the fire until it softened, then dabbed it into the seams of a cold patch above the door. He said nothing for a long while. Then softly, "My daddy said you used witchcraft." Clara didn't look up. "He's not the only one," the boy added. She nodded. Then finally, "Is he here?" The boy shook his head. "Didn't make it. He fell through the ice on the pond, looking for dry wood." She finished the patch, pressed it firm with her palm. "I'm sorry," she said. "He was wrong about you," the boy muttered. "They all were." "No," she replied. "They were scared, and fear makes you say things you don't believe, makes you hurt people who remind you of what you never tried." He blinked. "You ain't mad?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I was cold once," she said. "But that's worse than anger. I remember the cold more than I remember my husband's voice." The boy didn't understand that yet, but he would. They all would, because the cold kept coming, and her roof was only one roof. Soon, they'd need more, and someone would have to teach them how. By the 6th night, Clara's house no longer felt like hers. The fire still burned steady in the hearth, but the air was thick with the breath of 34 people. Children cried in their sleep. The floorboards creaked under shifting weight. Boots lined the walls like broken soldiers, wet, cracked, sagging from overuse. Blankets were shared between strangers. The last of the salt pork had been boiled into a broth so thin it barely stained the water, and yet they came. Every night, new shadows in the snow. Some stumbled up from the town. Some came from cabins deeper in the hills, where wind bit so hard it peeled bark off trees. She didn't turn them away, not once, not even when it meant her own boys slept sitting up, backs pressed to the fire bricks, arms around each other to share what warmth they could. But Clara was beginning to understand the cost. The roof held, yes. The moss was alive, still spongy under her palms when she climbed up at dawn to check the edges. The bark hadn't warped. The clay held its seal. But the fire, it wasn't meant to stretch this far. It groaned beneath the weight of so many bodies needing its heat. The draft had started to flicker. Twice now she'd seen smoke struggle to rise through the chimney, forced back down by winds too strong for the flue. She couldn't burn more wood. The supply was nearly gone, and snow buried the rest. They needed more than one warm house. They needed a way to survive after the hill thawed. She found Jonah again near the cellar steps, trying to wrap a length of torn burlap around his feet to keep the wet out. His hands shook, fingers purple at the edges. "Boots gone?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Left 'em drying by the fire last night. Someone took 'em. Guess they needed 'em more." She squatted beside him, reached for the burlap. "Let me," she said. He let her wrap his feet tight. When she was done, she handed him a scrap of boiled hide to lash around the soles. He stared at it. "Where'd you learn this?" he asked. She tied the last knot and sat back. "From being cold," she said. "From watching animals. From remembering how it feels to hear your own teeth click in the dark." Jonah stared down the stairs. "You think they'll all make it?" Clara didn't answer, because she didn't know. That afternoon, something changed. The snow eased. Not stopped, but softened. The wind dropped below, screaming. A hush fell over the valley. Smoke from the collapsed mill rose straight for the first time in days. And that's when Clara made her decision. They couldn't stay here. Not all of them. Not like this. The fire would fail. The moss roof could only do so much. Even a living roof needs rest. Too much condensation. Too many bodies pressing moisture into the walls. And the whole thing might sag. If it sagged, it might cave. And if it caved, they'd all be dead before sunrise. She gathered the able-bodied 6 men, 3 women, Jonah included, and stood them in the tiny kitchen where the floor still creaked from years of uneven weight. The children slept, the old ones dozed, and Clara, who had built something no man could understand, now needed them to trust her again. "There's no more wood," she said. They nodded. "There's no more food. We've got 1 more day's worth of broth if we stretch it." They said nothing. "This house is warm, but it won't stay that way. Not with this many. Not with the fire choking and the flue barely breathing." "Then what?" someone asked. "We go back down? To what? Ice and collapsed roofs?" She shook her head. "No, we go to the river." They blinked. "Down past the church," she said. "There's an old logging camp. I passed it last spring looking for root. Half buried. Still has walls. A big stone chimney. If we can dig it out, seal it, pack it like this roof." She let the sentence hang. Jonah caught it first. "We could move people. We could build," she said. 2 houses, maybe 3, just enough to hold what this one can't. If we get it packed with moss and bark in time, the heat from a single fire might hold." "You want us to build roofs like yours?" a woman asked. "No," Clara said. "I want you to help me teach others how, because I can't do it alone. Not again." They left at first light, 6 of them, snowshoes lashed from stripped branches and twine. Jonah led with Clara behind him, the others close, huddled like shadows crawling across a blinding field of white. The wind had calmed, yes, but the cold hadn't. It cut like glass now, thin and mean, the kind that creeps into bone. When they reached the church, they stopped, not out of reverence but surprise. There were bodies on the steps, not dead yet, but close. A family of 5, barely breathing. The mother had her shawl wrapped around 3 children. The father lay half buried in snow, one arm stretched toward the door, as if frozen in mid-knock. Clara knelt fast, broke open the blanket bundle, checked the children's hands, pressed fingers to chests. The fire in them still smoldered, but just barely. "Jonah," she snapped, "take my coat. Wrap the boy. You," she pointed to another man. "Take the girl." They moved without question, no longer doubting her, no longer mocking. By the time they reached the logging camp, they were carrying 3 unconscious children and a woman who could no longer walk. The cabin stood buried to the windowsills in drifted snow, but the chimney still rose proud, capped in ice. The door gave way after 3 hard shoves. Inside, silence, rot, an old iron stove still bolted to the floor. Clara stared at the walls, log, thick, warped but strong. They could make it work if they moved fast. They started digging with whatever they had: shovels, tin pots, bare hands wrapped in cloth. Clara stripped bark from every downed log nearby. Jonah gathered moss from tree trunks, scraping it with the edge of a can lid. Others hacked clay from the creek bank, crumbling it between fingers to test moisture. She showed them how to pack it, layer, then soak, weave moss into bark, press with heel and palm, not just fingers. Insist the clay bind all edges, leave no seam open. She showed them how to set stones against corners to trap the heat, how to wrap chimney pipes in earth to keep the flue warm, how to press ferns into rafter gaps to muffle wind. And they listened, because now it was life or death. By dusk they had sealed the first cabin. 2 boys lit a fire with kindling wrapped in oiled cloth. Smoke rose clean, the chimney held. Clara pressed her palm to the moss-layered wall and felt it, the heat slow but steady. It was working. They brought the children in first, then the mother, then the rest. It wasn't warm yet, but it wasn't dying. That was enough. Over the next 3 days they built 3 more moss roofs. Each one better than the last, each sealed tighter, each packed faster. Clara barely slept. She taught until her voice rasped. Her hands bled from bark splits and raw clay. Her legs trembled from frost, but she didn't stop, because every time a roof held, every time a fire lit without choking, she saw it in their faces, wonder, not just at the warmth, but at her. And she hated that most of all, because she hadn't done this for praise. She'd done it to survive. And now survival was a story they'd retell without her name. On the 8th night, she woke to whispers outside her own home again. But they weren't angry now. They weren't pounding the door. They were quiet, soft voices, children's feet, the sound of hope, not hate. She opened the door and saw what she never expected. The town, not all of them, but many, standing in a crooked line, holding baskets, carrying moss, bark, stones, even a broken stovepipe, hoisted by 2 men with stiff backs. They'd come not to accuse, but to learn, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt something stir beneath her ribs. Not grief, not shame, not fear, but the ache of something forgotten, something like belonging, because now, for once, they weren't mocking her moss roof. They were building their own. It was not spring that saved Hollow Creek. It was moss, bark, and the slow, painful willingness of a people to let go of their pride before it killed them. By the 12th night of the Great Freeze, the town that once laughed at a woman's roof had reshaped itself into something else. Less a town, more a circle of breath and bone, stitched together by desperation, and warmed by the lessons of one woman who'd never wanted to be a teacher. They built moss-roof shelters like hers, not out of reverence, but out of hunger, out of necessity, and slowly, out of awe. They called her strange behind her back still, but not with venom, with hesitation, with guilt, because the further they pressed their hands into the warmth of their newly sealed walls, the more they had to admit she'd been right before any of them had even seen the danger coming. And admitting that felt like peeling off their skin. But they did it anyway, because the cold had taken too much already. The first time Clara was asked to speak in front of them, really speak, not just show someone how to layer moss over a joist or patch a smoke leak with wet bark paste. It happened quietly. No stage, no announcement. It was just the town square, what remained of it, now a hollow of packed snow and trampled ash, with chairs and stumps arranged in a crooked ring around the only standing stove someone had managed to drag out from the storehouse and repurpose into a makeshift outdoor heater. She hadn't meant to lead anything. She came because someone told her there would be talk of rationing, and she had a sack of dried roots to offer. But when she arrived, they'd cleared a seat for her, not near the back, not off to the side, right in the center. She hesitated, then sat, and for the next 2 hours, nobody interrupted when she spoke. She explained how moss isn't magic, it's memory, how it holds what it knows, how it doesn't need to be taught to keep warmth inside. It just does, the way a mother does, the way a house must. She told them to think in layers, not strength, to stop looking for walls that fight the cold, and instead build walls that welcome warmth and refuse to let it go. She didn't know she was preaching, but they listened like she was. One man, Henry Talbot, whose own roof had caved on the 3rd night and buried his prized rifle, stood with tears running hot down his cheeks, face red from shame, and asked if she'd help him build a moss-covered barn when the snow cleared. Not for animals, for his wife. They'd been living in the cellar. Clara nodded once, then asked who else needed help, and every hand went up. She started drawing maps, not with ink, but with charcoal on bark sheets. She sketched out angles, roof slopes, chimney placements. She drew cross-sections of moss-packing patterns, ventilation holes, even clay mixing ratios based on soil moisture. She had no formal training, no schooling past the basics, but she understood shelter the way some people understood prayer, intuitively, reverently, with the full weight of someone who had once lain awake waiting to die from cold and now knew how not to. They began calling her Moss Mother. At first it was a joke. Jonah whispered it during a late-night sealing session when her knees gave out and he caught her elbow. But it stuck because no one else could do what she did. And by then, even those who once feared her began speaking her name with something resembling care. One morning, they found a horse dead in the square, starved. It had wandered up from one of the outlying ranches, frost hanging from its eyelashes, ribs visible like fence slats. It dropped just short of the co-op cabin, where 3 babies slept packed beside each other in a cradle made from salvaged apple crates and wool coats. It should have been a death like all the others, a simple loss. But Clara didn't let it pass. She had the men haul it to the edge of the ravine, strip the hide, salvage every sinew, every bone. She salted what meat remained, dried it above slow heat. The hide she softened with spit and root paste. She used it to wrap the doorframe of one of the newer moss cabins, one where an old woman had kept coughing all night from drafts near the threshold. That day the coughing stopped, and the story of the horse became a story of mercy, not misery. Jonah carved the ribs into hooks, hung cooking pots from them. The children didn't cry as much that night. The mayor never came, neither did the sheriff. No one had seen them since the 4th night, when their cabin caught fire, and no one answered their shouts. By the time Clara's boys ran down with snow pails, the building had collapsed into a black smoking pile. No bodies were recovered. Some said they'd run, some said they'd frozen deep in the woods, away from the shame of their failure. Clara never speculated. She simply filled the void, unwillingly at first, but someone had to. It started with food shares, then wood rationing. Then she started pairing families, those with warmth but little food, and those with stores but sagging roofs. She never commanded. She simply asked, and people listened. The power didn't come from title. It came from warmth, and from the memory of her opening that door on the worst night of the freeze. Then came the letter, brought by a rider half dead, and wrapped in a mailbag crusted in ice. He stumbled into the square mid-morning, white to his eyebrows, and collapsed before he spoke. When they thawed his hands enough to pull the oilcloth pouch from his coat, they found 3 sealed letters, 2 for neighboring towns and one addressed simply, "To the leader of Hollow Creek." He hadn't known who to give it to. Someone handed it to Clara without question. She opened it with the blade she kept in her apron, careful not to tear the parchment. It was from the county office, a formal notice. Reports of catastrophe, possibility of famine, outbreak of disease, the need for a tally of survivors and deaths, instructions to burn any bodies unfit for burial to avoid sickness, directions for where to expect supply runners once the roads cleared. She read it twice, then folded it and slid it into her pocket. "We'll send a reply tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, we bury them proper." And they did. They dug through frozen earth, 5 feet deep, lined it with stone, covered the lost with cloth instead of ash. They wept, they prayed, they did not burn, and somehow the fire in the new moss shelters still held. The last freeze broke on the 17th night, not with a thaw, but with silence. A kind of silence the cold never brings. You know it when it happens. The trees stop creaking, the wind dies entirely, the snow hardens underfoot but stops shifting. The air holds itself, and into that stillness comes a feeling, not warmth exactly, but potential, the promise of a sun you haven't felt yet. Clara woke before anyone else. She stood outside, boots frozen to the porch planks, eyes on the horizon. The moss above her steamed gently, dew collecting on its tips. She touched it, warm, alive. Behind her, inside the cabin, 32 people slept, none of them dying, none of them mocking her, none of them alone. She stepped down into the snow and began walking toward the second moss house. She had work to do. One evening, weeks after the last snow, Jonah came to her with a bundle in his arms. He had grown taller somehow, shoulders no longer sloped with shame. His boots fit. His voice didn't crack when he spoke. He laid the bundle down on her porch. It was moss, not fresh, but packed, dried, pressed, sealed in bark. "For the next one," he said, "in case you ever decide to build again." She raised an eyebrow. "You think I'll need another roof?" He shrugged. "If not you, someone. It's not yours anymore, what you made. It's all of ours now." And that was the moment Clara understood she would never be alone again. Not really. Not even if the moss vanished and the bark fell to dust, because the warmth she'd created had reached further than her walls. It had settled into their bones. By late spring, the town was unrecognizable. The church had no roof, but the congregation met under moss awnings hung from felled cedar beams. The mayor's house, long since burned, had been replaced by 3 smaller shelters, each housing 5 families. Chimneys had been rebuilt with earth-packed stone, fire channels rerouted to heat walls instead of just air. People sat outside in the evening sun to share food, and not a soul laughed when the children built tiny moss houses out of sticks and mud. They had names for their new designs, some some named after trees, some after birds, but all of them shared one quiet feature, the pattern Clara had shown them, the layering, the seams, the silent faith that warmth could be earned with hands and moss and time. A traveling tinker passed through in June and called it sorcery. Clara's boys just smiled. No spells, one of them said, just bark and green stuff. When the government riders finally came, they expected disaster. They came with wagons full of salted meat, hard tack, warm clothes. They came expecting corpses, wreckage, frostbite, starvation. They'd seen it in other towns, whole counties lost. But when they reached Hollow Creek, they found smoke rising steady from 20 moss-roofed homes, lines strung with drying moss, and people walking barefoot through the muddy square. They saw 3 women wrapping ferns in clay paste, 2 men building a chimney with notched logs. Children ran through puddles, no one cried, and in the center of it all was Clara Avery, not on a stage, not behind a desk, just kneeling beside a wall, showing a girl how to wedge a stone between bark slabs without cracking the seal. When they asked who was in charge, the townsfolk didn't answer right away, not because they didn't know, but because no one had called Clara a leader before. She wasn't elected, she was earned. One woman finally nodded toward her. "That's the one you're looking for," she said. "That's Moss' mother." The riders blinked. Moss? They didn't understand, but they wrote her name down anyway. Clara didn't care. She kept working. That winter, not a single home in Hollow Creek burned. Not one child froze. No chimney collapsed. No wall split. No family begged space in another's shelter. Because they'd all built it together. Because they remembered. Because once, when everything else failed, a woman who'd lost her husband and buried her pride built a roof that breathed and warmed the town that laughed at her. And now, no one laughed, no one mocked. And when the snow came again, falling soft and slow over a town now covered in green humps and bark seams and mossy eaves, it did not bring fear. It brought silence, the kind of silence that holds, like moss, soft, sure, enduring.